We're continuing our discussion of apologetics. I would like to just give a bit of context. Let's see where we're at in the flow of thought for this course so far. And our first part of the course was focused on a philosophy of apologetics. This is where we discussed what is apologetics, defining it, biblical examples of apologetics, and methods of apologetics. This third point here, critically, we talked about a distinction between classic, evidentialist, fideist, and presuppositionalist apologetics. And it's important for us to understand the difference between those approaches so that we're just conscious of what we're doing as we move between the different approaches and as we work with them. We took a break to talk about a specific issue, the problem of evil, just because it is so significant for so many different discussions. But that brings us to the second section of our course, where I'm talking about specific application. If the first section of the course was a philosophy of apologetics or a method understanding what we're doing in apologetics, now we're moving into specific groups that we're going to speak to. And I'll have more to say later about the relationships between these different groups. For now, let me just point out what we're doing or the discussions we're going to have. So we're going to talk about examples like evolution and secular materialism, secular humanism and irreligion, theology, a theology of false religions as an introduction to what follows, Catholicism, Arianism, Iglesia ni Cristo, Jehovah's Witness, Islam, Mormonism, Buddhism, Seventh-day Adventism, animism, Hinduism, and other minor groups. So this is our plan, but I'm just noticing here, everything in the second group of these, or the majority of these really, are religious views. And before we break into these religious views where I'm starting with some irreligious or anti-religious views, i.e. secular views. And that's our discussion today, specifically evolution and secular materialism. So let's take a moment and understand, before I start to discuss it, just what do I even mean by secular materialism? And one or two quick comments here so that we have context. Secular means non-religious. Really, that's the meaning of the word. And the concept of it goes, it's secular because you're looking for explanations for God and the universe, or a way to understand, not God, for the universe, a way to understand the world apart from religion. So secular meaning a non-religious explanation of the world. What's true? What exists? How do we know what's true? How should we live our lives without thinking about God? A second component of this, secular materialist. Materialism means we assume that matter and energy are all that exist. There is no other kind of thing. And what I'm giving as specific examples here, there is no spirit, mind, or other existence beyond the physical world. If it's not atoms, if it's not energy, it's not real. And of course, to be fair to the view, they're going to talk about things like love or truth. They're going to talk about courage, time. They're going to talk about those kinds of concepts. The assumption, though, is that all of those concepts are built on the foundation of the physical world. So the world of atoms, the world of energy, the world of things moving around, physical realities. All of these other things are derivative of that. And when I say love, then what I mean in a secular materialist view is that the neurons in my head are firing in such a way that I have a strong feeling. That feeling we call love. It's working in that the configuration of the chemical reactions happening in my brain is somehow corresponding to the external world. And when that works out, so that my assumptions about the world, the chemical states in my head, work out to match the physical world, we call that truth. Okay. And all of the different discussions that we have then are derivative of a physical world. I'll pause here for a second and just point out, when I say something like, materialism assumes that there is no spirit, mind, or other existence outside of the physical world, a part of you might feel a little weird about the notion of there being other existences, particularly if I say spirit. But the notion that there's something outside of the physical world, you can feel a little odd about that. You also can feel a little bit odd about what I said a bit earlier, that all that exists is the physical world. But my point in this is to say, I think materialism invades our thinking too. And so any discussion of spirit or mind and that kind of thing sounds a little bit like moving in the direction of superstition or something. I would argue, let's look at intellectual history across the history of the world, and let's recognize that thinkers in the history of careful philosophical thought have recognized and grappled with the realities of other things besides just the physical. And in philosophy, what this gets talked about, or how this gets described, is monism versus dualism. And the idea of dualism is the idea that there's not just only a physical world, but there must also be ideas. There must also be thinking, mind, or spirit. And that distinction between two kinds of things is the recognition that's very common in intellectual history, that we can't just only live in a physical world. Well, that's part of the question. That's part of the question of secular materialism. Is it possible that the world is only physical things? And let's talk about this for a bit. I'm going to start out by talking about, I said intellectual history. I want to talk about the story of the last 1500 years. I should be very open about this. When I say 1500 years, I'm saying 1500 years in a very specific context. I am admittedly talking about a European context. And I recognize that I'm teaching in a non-European context. Just two comments I'll make here. One, during this same period, the 1500 years, and particularly the last 500 years that I'm talking about, so much of the intellectual influence, it just, like it or not, reject it or not, it's just there. So much of the intellectual influence has come from European thought. And the reality is, within those 500 years, the move of secularization, historically speaking, has spread around the world until you end up with very, very, very interesting dynamics, such as several countries within Southeast Asia that would identify as communist. Communist, an idea that spreads largely through Russia, going backwards towards Karl Marx, which in terms of intellectual history is tapping directly into what we're talking about here. Other countries in Southeast Asia are going to identify as capitalist. There's going to be democracies all across Southeast Asia, and all across the world for that matter. And we're recognizing that some of these ideas also were born during this period of 500 years. So I recognize that the history I'm giving is Europe-centric. I'm not saying necessarily that for the history of the world, I'm going to do everything Europe-centric. In fact, I like studying history in a non-European-centric way. But I am saying that some of these ideas had their start, unfortunately, in Europe during these 500 years. Well, let me talk about the ideas themselves then. And I'll start with this. Go back to more than 1,500 years ago. For about 1,000 years, the Roman Catholic Church was the center of power. I'm talking about 300 to 1500. And so here we're talking about before the fall of Rome, but Rome is already starting to weaken. Up through, if you want to put a time on it, about the time of Magellan traveling around the world. And in that framework then, for a good 1,200 years, the Catholic Church is the center of control. That means that knowledge is restricted to a small group of elites. That means that the Catholic Church can control not just religion, and this is important, less a religious institution, really a political power. And during this era, when we think of Europe, we can recognize that actually for this period of about 1,000 years, Europe is not leading the way at all, really. Some of the most exciting things that are happening in the world are happening in China, India, and even the Middle East. Some of the great developments and advances that were happening in those regions of the world outstripped Europe. In many ways, Europe was far behind. But there was a control during this time, a paralyzing control of the Catholic Church that was not just religious, but was actually political and an issue of power and money. An interesting thing happens beginning in the 1200s. In the 1200s and then increasing through the 1400s, the Catholic Church weakens politically. And there are a lot of reasons for that, multiple different political developments that happened. But it became apparent that cracks were starting to form in the foundation for the Catholic Church. At the same time, printing and other technologies are starting to happen. And some of those technologies are happening in a way that are starting to spread ideas quickly. And that means starting in the 1500s or so, you have 500 years of very rapid progress in scientific learning, technology, quality of life. Okay, I'm talking about now the period between 1500 and now. So to put that back, let's get that into an overview. Again, initially there's about 1,000 years of the Catholic Church holding power, controlling power, and really in so many ways, Europe is behind. There's a change now, things loosen up, things break in the power of the Catholic Church, which as a Protestant I view as a positive thing. But together with that breaking, there are new technologies, there are massive advances in development, and in the following 500 years, 1500 until now, huge changes in the world. Again, I view those as positive things. I'm glad to be alive now and not 500 years ago. Together with that, we can recognize the last 30 years that there's an explosion in the last 30 years of our lifetimes. There's an explosion in electronics, the internet, in a way that is another massive change in the human ability to convey information. One other massively significant historical event during this time that's worth paying attention to happens in 1859. 1859 is Darwin's Origin of the Species. And this is significant because it finally gives a solution for how life could originate without a creator. Now, whether one views that as a sufficient solution or not, I don't, is another question. And of course, even if you follow Darwin's view, the progress of time has led to significantly more development and thought about what that would mean, even from his original theory. But that was a very important beginning for people thinking about evolution. For the first time, you did not need a creator in order to explain life, at least for people that found this theory compelling. And here's the result of all of that. As a result of all of this progress and all of this change in terms of science and technology, people today tend to give science a powerful place in defining truth, so that we ask science to answer questions it was never designed to answer. It means that people put their faith in words like progress. And people think about the newest technology or the newest development with the assumption that we are better now. But we have a tendency to stop asking basic human questions, critical human questions like, why is there something instead of nothing? What is my purpose? What does all of this mean? What happens next? Those kinds of philosophical, humanizing questions that are at the core of our existence. Let me just drop a couple of thoughts in here before I keep on going. C.S. Lewis has a fabulous discussion on this where he just comments to say, I'm happy to listen to a credible scientist, a doctor, someone who has a particular solution to a particular medical or scientific problem. And so therefore, if, let's say, I'm having an organic, part of, my heart is not functioning as it ought to be functioning. It's functioning at 60% of what it should be doing. I'm happy to have a doctor look at it or examine me or find out if there's a solution. I'd like to see if we can do something about it. I'm happy to ask a politician to try to solve a problem, let's say transportation. Let's see if we can get the bus lines working together better. Okay, great. I can see that. But then Lewis comments, and yet when it comes down to a question of values and meaning, do I want a politician to settle for me a question of how I live my life in terms of ethics, or what people ought to be doing, or what is right, or what is good? And I understand that all of these fields, they intertwine, and it's complicated to sort them out. So many legal decisions are intertwined with ethics, and they can't be separated. But Lewis' comment is that the politician is not the person to just by his power settle this. This is a question that we have to have together, a discussion we have to have together. What is right? What is good? And I'll fit that in now with what I'm asking here. Is science really accredited to answer these basic kinds of questions? Something that concerns me here is that in scientific discussions about, let's say, genetics or end-of-life decisions or abortion, the assumption goes someone who is a doctor can tell me what is the right thing to do. What is the right thing to do for an end-of-life decision? And at what point do we cease doing medical treatment and so forth? And the assumption is, well, he's a doctor. He is a doctor. He's not an ethicist. And on ethical questions, I ought to be having a discussion on the ethical level. Or in this case, do I ask science to answer basic questions about human purposes? No. Science can't answer those questions. Science can talk to us about the physical world, but these kinds of questions belong in a different domain. We ought to be talking about these on the level of philosophy, religion, faith. The result of this is during the last 200 years, secularists have assumed that all of this progress came because we abandoned religion. Thinking back, remember I said the Catholic Church had a hold. In some ways, this was holding back, or this was retarding the ability of society to progress and to think because there was a strong control. Well, that breaks free, right? And eventually in the Renaissance and Reformation, there's a freedom now to start working with ideas, the result of which is lots of development in terms of technologies. The assumption is that religion was the problem. I'm arguing here that religion was not the problem. The Catholic Church, institutionally, was part of the problem. And that is a political institution, but not religion. During this period, secularists have repeatedly predicted that religion will vanish as science steps forward and takes over. The assumption is we have now moved into a better and more developed thinking about the world. We're scientific now. We don't need all of this mythological and superstitious religion. Science has replaced it. And so religion's just going to fade away because now science is our answer. They have been confident that science will eventually answer the deepest questions of existence. And yet it's very interesting just to note that religion has held on during this period, or even increased during this period. Some of the strongest spokespersons for the secularization thesis, the idea that the more scientific or the more wealthy we get in terms of both finances and just education, that we will become less and less religious. They've actually now admitted that they were wrong. The progress of humanity in terms of education and technology does not necessarily lead to the elimination of religion. And I think there's a very basic human reason for that. The underlying human reason for this is that science and technology don't answer the deepest questions of our existence. We need more. We need an answer to fundamental basics about the world and about ourselves. And on those points, That's not a scientific question. It's really a philosophical or a religious question. Now, I'm going to move back then into talking about secular materialism specifically. And this is underneath defining the view. I'm just going to go deeper now, talking about what is secular materialism and how does it work. And I'd like to point out first that there are actually very few atheistic materialists. What I mean by that, I'm talking about secular materialists, people who believe in only the physical world, matter and energy, that's all there is, and interpreting the world apart from God. Okay, but take it another step. The majority of people who speak in these ways are actually not atheist, they're agnostic. What do we mean by that? Let's talk about that for a moment. The distinction between atheist and agnostic. Atheism would definitively or positively assert that there is no God. A much intellectually safer view, an easier one to defend, is a view that says, I can't really say. Maybe there is a God, maybe there's not. Don't know. Can't say. And it's a much safer view because at that point it's almost impossible to attack. In other words, it's in the viewpoint, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but we can't know. There's no way to tell. And the majority of people who are secular materialists are actually in that category because it's, of course, an easier view to hold, an easier view to defend. If you're actually looking for atheists, you're looking for people who explicitly will say, I believe there is no God, you're probably looking at a far lower percentage. I've looked at a lot of studies, efforts to try to do this, and they're taking into account the world. I mean, they really are investigating nations where atheism has a higher percentage. And they're going to recognize that it's probably different numbers here, but the center of the most of them, probably less than 10% worldwide. And arguably significantly less than that. Now, that's interesting because the impression we get is that the intellectual, sophisticated world, the majority of people out there outside of my little bubble, all of those people, they're probably all atheists. And what you discover is even in countries where we assume this is a highly atheist country, I'm going to mention China as an example. Even in such countries, you discover a lot of religious activity going on. A lot. And it might be in the form of worshiping ancestors or offering incense or a kind of a folk Buddhism in the case of China. It's a lot. There is a lot of religious activity happening. And even if people would say, I'm not sure how to talk about God, or I don't know exactly how to know what's true, they have some kind of shadowy, indefinite conception of there at least being a divine being, that there has to be one. And that's, I'm going to trace that theologically down into the human heart, the image of God in man. I'm going to trace that down to how compelling the cosmological argument is, that this world had to come from somewhere. And so just to say, it just popped into being is a highly unconvincing view. I'm going to recognize then that across the world, 90% or more of people have some kind of suspicion that there is a God. They may not be able to say who, what, how. They're probably going to say something like, I believe in a sort of a divine being, but they're not going to altogether deny the existence of God. Most atheists are actually agnostics. They can't say for sure whether he exists or not. And what that results in is a really interesting, I'll just call it a kind of a vague religious view. Most materialists have some kind of vague religion that covers some of the questions that they can't answer. And as I said earlier, it's kind of a shadowy divine being sort of thing. They'll jump to that when it's necessary. When it's necessary to talk about a loved one dies, or you kind of want to think about some kind of existence after the present existence. And so you kind of kind of jump over to that and talk about them going to a better place. What is that better place? How does one get there? Does everyone get there? Am I going to meet very, very, very wicked people in this better place? What's it like? Who's there? None of those questions are answered. You just sort of throw out a shadowy idea. Okay, I have conversations with people fairly regularly about this kind of thing. I'll just ask someone, so what do you believe about God? And I'll get very vague responses, something like, well, he's up there and he's really powerful and good. Okay, I mean, that's a beginning. Up there, that's a little weird. But anyway, it's a beginning. But there's not really a defined, how would I know who he is? Has he spoken? What things are true about him? What things are false about him? How would we talk about him? How do we relate to him? Does he care what we do? And if he does care what we do, then what things ought we to be doing and what things should we not be doing? When I talk about those kinds of questions, none of that's there. We're just going to stick with kind of a shadowy, there's a divine being and we like him. And he likes us. Definitely he likes us. Do we take the time then to think through what we're talking about? Well, no, because most materialists will function on the physical level in materialism. When they move out into the philosophical questions, they'll kind of jump back without recognizing it into a kind of shadowy religion. The majority of non-scientific people, what I mean is people who are working in trade industries, and so they're not in the discipline of science. The majority of people today have a very high view of science. Okay, I do also, if we're talking about true and careful science, because of how it has so massively changed our lives. Right? And so if I think about the benefits of medicine and communication, transportation, and just general ease of life, technology has massively transformed my life. It's massively transformed yours. So we tend to have a very high view of technology and science, and it takes in forms such as ideas such as the future will probably be better than the present. The past is worse than the present. Why? Because the assumption is we're moving forward. Progress is always the assumption that the future will be better and the past was worse. And there are some ideas there that are legitimate. I'm glad for antibiotics. I'm glad for the technology I'm using to record this for you right now. But the move from that to the assumption that the philosophical and religious views of the past were also inferior to now. And that the future and the views of the future define where things are going and where we ought to be, that's a good move. Those kinds of questions are really big assumptions, things that we ought to actually think about. As a result of this, then you have people who will just talk about science. Okay, let's answer our questions from science, but never actually ask the deeper questions about existence, right and wrong, and how we know what defines right and wrong. And I'll give one other final piece to this as a kind of a summary for how many of the people that we're interacting with are thinking. A lot of people in middle age have honestly given up on understanding the universe or the most basic questions of existence. I'm not saying that they've stopped learning. What I am saying is questions like the most basic questions of human existence. Questions like, where did I come from? Why is there anything rather than nothing? What defines truth? What defines right and wrong? What are the standards or the canons of right and wrong? And how can we ground those things philosophically on rock solid foundations? Those kinds of questions, people at some point give up. What happens after I die? How should I be living to prepare for that? Why does my action matter in this universe? On some of those basic questions, people don't have answers. They don't know where to turn. They just live, exist, make money, find goals, pursue things, but they don't know what happens next. And I'm thinking here of a biography that I read, Walter Isaacson of Steve Jobs, on Steve Jobs. Excellent biography, very enjoyable. Steve Jobs is the CEO of Apple, passed away if I remember correctly, about 10 years ago. And Steve Jobs, at the very end of his life, is having a conversation with Isaacson. And the question goes, Jobs knows that he's close to death. And the question goes, what do you think happens after death? And Jobs says, well, I don't know. I mean, it does seem like it does seem not to make sense that we would work hard and accumulate wisdom and learn and live our lives, and then we would get to the end and then just die and it's all gone. That doesn't make sense. And I think he's grabbing onto something. What's the point of living? What's even what did I contribute to anything lasting if it's just gone as soon as I die? And then Steve Jobs says, and yet on the other hand, maybe it's just like turning off a cell phone or turning off a computer, and you turn off the switch and poof, it's done. And maybe that's it. And that's the end of the book. He dies. And to me, that's profoundly terrifying. To think that you come to the end, you live your whole life, you die, and it's kind of, I don't know what happens next, I hope it works out. I don't view that as a valid way to live life or responsible way to live life. That's horrifying, that's terrifying. Do we have answers? Do we understand anything about what's actually going on in the world around us? Well, I'm going to move into a separate topic, and I want to talk about the Christian view on science. Because at the center, when we're talking about secular materialism, I mean, the discussion here is wrapped around our view of science. Is science a good guide to truth? Is science a dependable guide to truth? And how should we interact with it? And let me start with this first of all, because I am later going to have an extended discussion with you about evolution particularly, and how we process evolution. I don't view evolution as a sufficient explanation of life and how life got here. So we're going to have that discussion later on. But I would like to start with this first and just be quite clear that as Christians, we are in favor of science. We love science. We affirm science as a rich activity that believers ought to be engaged in. And we affirm it as a good. Studying science is a good thing and a blessing that we have as human beings. So let me show you a couple of supports for that even biblically. Genesis 1:28, God blessed them. He said to them, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And if I continue going, I come to Psalm 8 that quotes essentially or echoes Genesis 1:26. To say, when I consider all of your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man? Well, you have made man a little lower than the angels. You've crowned him with glory and honor. You've given him dominion over the works of your hands. You've put all things under his feet. And the conclusion of the psalm is as the beginning, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth. Two comments to draw from that. Number one, this refrain in Psalm 8, O Lord, your majesty is seen in heaven and earth. How excellent is your name in all the earth. And even you can do this in Psalm 19. You can do this in quite a few different psalms, actually. Is the concept that as I look at creation and as I look at the world, one of the things I see is the majesty of God. And in that sense, then, we richly support science. No, actually, we love science. We are happy to lead the way in science as we have the opportunity. Leading in science, working in science, studying science is an expression of awe at the wisdom and the intelligence of our God creating this world. So that as you and I encounter the things he made, we look at it and say, these are the fingerprints of a brilliant designer who has made this. And in that sense, we affirm and love science. If I'm going back to Genesis 1, one of the concepts there, he's saying, have dominion over the earth, subdue it. That doesn't necessarily, that's not the idea that I go out, try to find an animal somewhere, wrestle it to the ground. There, I subdued a part of creation. The idea of it goes, go and exercise your intelligence as a human being, do things, take care of the garden, do things on planet Earth using the intelligence that God has given you. And the concept in that, then, is that part of what we're doing in science is an expression of the image of God. It's showing our nature as humans, that we go out and we work on things, we do things to enjoy his creation, and yes, to even make it more suited, to organize it. And there's nothing wrong with that. So again, my assumption of this, or my foundation in this, is that science is a richly good thing. I can talk also about other passages that develop this concept. One of them that stands out is Romans 1. And the argument of Romans 1 is that that which may be known of God is manifest. God has showed it. People everywhere know that there is a God. How so? Well, the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Things that are made, the idea of it goes, you and I look around us and we see a created world, and the pressing question becomes, how did this created world get here? And the only answer can be, an eternally powerful God created this world. And in that sense then, science, true science and careful science, leads us to him. Recognizing how rich, how complex, how intricate this world is, the more you study it, you can't help but respond in awe. One of the things that's very fascinating about listening to scientists speak is that they will discover some of this richness, and they will speak in adoration types of terms. They'll say something like, and it's so amazing what Mother Nature or creation, not creation, Mother Nature or planet Earth has given us, and the power of evolution to deliver this rich complexity. And they'll speak in what are actually teleological or designed terms, as if something personal made it. But what they're actually doing is rejecting any kind of personal interaction in the creation of the world. And my argument then is that underneath this, as we study science and as we see the richness of the created world, it is pointing to something more. Even if you deny it, you're recognizing there's something more underneath this. An important concept for thinking about science. As Christians, we affirm science, but second, I would like to just remember and highlight, scientists are just people too. Now that cuts in both directions, two directions at the same time. Scientists are people too, and it goes in this direction. They are made in the image of God. They have real wisdom. They have real skill. And these are very intelligent people. Be respectful. All right, in a little bit in our next lecture, I'm going to talk about evolution, and I'm going to talk about why I don't view that as a sufficient explanation for the world. Sometimes, however, in creationist discussions of evolution, in an attempt to try to settle the issue and make it very, very clear, we have a tendency to be mocking, dismissive. We have a tendency to talk about evolutionists as though they are they're foolish people, they're idiotic, they're not recognizing basic realities. I would like to affirm here that scientists, yes, evolutionists, secular materialists, are very intelligent people. They're made in the image of God. They have the intelligence that God gave to all humans. Be respectful. Don't be mocking. Now that's one direction then. Be respectful and recognize that reality. These are not stupid people. On the other hand, though, scientists are just people, which is to say that they are very intelligent, clever people. A difference is just, I start from one foundation to think about the world. I start from the foundation of believing that God exists. They start from a different foundation when they think about the world. They start from the assumption that God does not exist. So it's no surprise that we come to different conclusions. And it's not because I'm intelligent and they aren't. They're very intelligent and very accomplished. They know far more about their field, obviously. But we come from different starting points. And with that recognition, then, we recognize that scientists are limited in their knowledge, and they make real mistakes. That exists. That happens. Particularly whenever I start to try to take science and use it to answer philosophical or religious questions, I'm using the wrong tool, and I will come to the wrong conclusions. Two explanations or two ways of talking about this. One, I'd love to show you just a little window into the limits of our scale. The reality that as humans, yes, we see a lot, but we only go so far in our ability and in what we see. This is an app I've enjoyed that puts different things, different elements of the physical world into their physical context or their size context. Okay, so you can see here in the middle, average man, average woman, and then just different animals that you recognize. Going down to some very small animals, a chicken egg, you know what a chicken egg looks like, insects, go down to the size of an ant. Okay, so that's the idea. We're getting smaller and smaller as we move across. And here's what I'm wanting to highlight. Keep on going. Okay, we're getting down to, here are some things that we can see, even some things that we can do. Somebody created this and just using tiny, tiny, tiny tools is able to build something. Okay, well, we keep on going though. And we're getting down into the size or the scale of things. We're moving into, this is DNA. Now we're moving into atoms. Just to comment here, when we're talking on this scale, these are models. You can use electron microscopes and you can see very, very, very small scales. And some of the newest technologies with chips are functioning on the atomic level like this. But you get down to this scale, and these are ideas that we know are necessary. But particularly here, talking about protons and neutrons, no one's ever seen a proton or a neutron. They can be manipulated. But we're talking about ideas that we have to now understand in order for everything to work. But these are models. Keep on going further down, and we're talking about very elementary particles, electrons, positrons, and then we're getting down into hypotheticals. We get down into a scale that we can't even really imagine. And on this scale, then you start talking about quarks, parts of these fundamental particles. And some of these particles that can't be proven one way or another, we think they might exist, but they're still up for grabs. People are questioning whether maybe does it exist or does it not exist? We're not sure. And my point in that is to say you go small enough and we can't comprehend it anymore. It's just a limit of our scale. Okay, try going the opposite direction. I'm going to move from here, we're back to where we were, average man, average woman. Start scaling out, and here's objects that you can actually see and kind of have a direct grasp of. But you keep on going. You're going to get eventually to, some of these are hypothetical. You're going to get eventually to things that we can talk about, like here, Pluto, the moon. I can see the moon. We're going to get further into planets, Neptune, Saturn, Jupiter, the largest planet. In that you see the sun, massive. Okay, but I just want you to appreciate the scale here. Keep on going to larger and larger stars. And now I'm talking about huge stars that dwarf our sun. Our sun is a small sun, or a small star. And keep on going, and you're going to get into, here's one light month. Here's one light year. I can go further out and I can talk about the local cloud. We're not even to the scale of galaxy yet. And keep on moving, and there's our galaxy. We're just a tiny part of our galaxy. But then among our galaxy, look, endless galaxies moving outwards. And you can keep on extending the scale. Here are clusters of galaxies. Here is the observable universe, all of the light that we could possibly see. And that kind of scale, a question that occurs to me, do we have the ability to think that kind of scale at all? Do we understand? Can we talk about that? It highlights, I think, the limits of what we really can know and do. that on this level we go beyond what we actually can comprehend. Second concept that I find very helpful. Thomas Kuhn wrote a small book. It's easy to read. It's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And his idea of this is that so many of our scientific conclusions are actually just models. Right? Okay, here's reality. No one has ever seen a photon. No one has ever seen an electron. We see what electrons do, but we don't actually see electrons. No one has ever been outside of our galaxy. No one has ever been outside of our solar system. No one has been any further than just a little bit past the moon. And even within our solar system, we have sent some probes out, and we have been able to collect some data from barely outside of our own solar system. Voyager 1 was a probe that we sent out a couple of decades ago, and it's now past our solar system, and we've been able to collect a little bit of data. But you realize in that scale, it's just a tiny, tiny part of what exists. And we're doing our best to try to understand. But do we have understanding really of the universe? And Kuhn's argument goes that actually we build up models, so we have an idea of how the world works. Let's say like Newtonian physics. We have an idea about how the world works, and so that can work well enough because, yeah, all of the experiments, we're getting the results, they fit. But every once in a while we have an experiment that doesn't quite fit the information. And so we try to find a new way to fit that into the model. And so we can kind of squeeze some things into the Newtonian model. And a little bit more progress goes by, we discover some other things, and eventually, okay, well, that doesn't fit the information anymore, but maybe I can still kind of squeeze it in. And you can kind of keep on squeezing in or bolting new things to make the model hold together. The problem is that eventually the problems in the model build up, and you end up with so many problems that the model kind of collapses and a new one comes in to take its place. In this case, what I'm talking about is after Newtonian physics, well, Einstein and general relativity and special relativity and quantum physics. And it's the recognition then that a model is not it's not a clear revelation of truth. It's an attempt to try to do our best to understand the things that we have, the information that comes to us, but it's never perfect because scientists are just people too. A couple of other just data points that intrigue me. There's a really interesting documentary. It's called The Most Unknown. And it's a discussion of this kind of dynamic in science, going through different areas to say in multiple different areas, we are limited in what we can possibly know. And you find in this discussion of physics, biology, time, psychology, general science, comments from accredited, careful scientists, leaders in their field, with comments like, you know, we're just getting started. Or a biologist comments, we have evidence that there are about 35 trillion microbial species. We've met about 1 million out of the 35 trillion. Or to talk about things like physics, just to say, we really don't know. We think maybe, and we're guessing possibly. And in cases like time or psychology, basically throwing up our hands, we don't have a clue. One other form like this, or one other data point like this, there's a very interesting book Stephen Hawking wrote, a number of just like popular level introductions into physics. And he just comments here on the deepest ultimate questions. Let me read this for you and we can talk about this, or we can think about, ponder his insights here. Hawking comments, even if there's only one possible unified theory, it is just a set of rules and equations. This is Hawking writing as a physicist. The question he wants to know, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? The usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the questions of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? Is the universal theory so compelling that it brings about its own existence? Does it need a creator? And if so, does he have any other effect on the universe? And who created him? Up to now, most scientists have been too occupied with the development of new theories that describe what the universe is to ask the question, why? And on the other hand, the people whose business it is to ask why, the philosophers, have not been able to keep up with the advance of scientific theories. In the 18th century, philosophers considered the whole of human knowledge, including science, to be their field, and discussed questions such as, did the universe have a beginning? If we do discover a complete theory, it should in time be understandable in broad principle by everyone, not just a few scientists. Then we shall all, philosophers, scientists, and just ordinary people, be able to take part in the discussion of the question of why it is that we and the universe exist. If we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. He has some brilliant insights in here, except the limitation here, to assume that we will uncover this, that we will reach this point. And it, I think, highlights or supports my notion again that science and secular materialism can answer some questions, but not all of the questions. And that in many cases we're trying to answer the wrong questions using science, when in fact we should be focused on scientific questions using scientific methods, philosophical and religious questions using revelation, I believe, as a Christian. Well, I'm going to pause there. In our next lecture, we'll talk further about evolutionary materialism, specifically talking about origins of life and attempts to explain life using evolution. And we'll conclude with how to talk to a materialist, how you proceed. But I'll just end here with the encouragement again. As a believer, be grateful for science, love science, be respectful to people who have achieved great understanding in their fields, and yet recognize that science is limited. It's limited, obviously, to scientific questions. And the greater questions we're having to ask about meaning, about value, about truth, about right and wrong, about why any of this exists in the first place, these are philosophical questions. And ultimately, they are questions with a religious answer. They are questions answered by the existence of the true God. And on that basis, then, find your certainty. That's the starting point that you and I use as we seek to understand the world.